The Middle East is on fire. The Islamic State, also known as ISIS, has slaughtered and destroyed the homes of thousands, while preaching their brand of violent extremism. Iran is playing the game of great powers to cement their hegemony over the Islamic world. These two Middle East powers, both claiming the mantle of caliphate, prepare for holy war. And the responsibility for this lays in the hands of the Federal Reserve. Follow along as we see how all of this fits together. Let's connect the dots.
My fellow Americans,
Islamist militants on the move in northeast Nigeria.
Notably, European Union leaders who stayed away in protest over Russia's...
Look at your TV screen right now. This is on the search for fugitive drug lord El Chapo, okay?
ISIS rose from the ashes of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. One could trace their roots back over a century, but for the purpose of this video we have limited it to the past decade and a half. On the morning of September 11th, 2001, 4 airliners were hijacked by 19 terrorists, who had sworn loyalty to Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, whose goals were to remove all Western influence from Muslim holy lands and establish a global caliphate. This attack, which resulted in the deaths of 3,000 Americans, was met with military retaliation by the United States and NATO. In 2002, the Bush administration was under the impression that Saddam Hussein either obtained, or was trying to obtain, weapons of mass destruction. This perception was fueled by a history of Saddam Hussein's regime refusing to allow weapons inspectors into Iraq, along with a report from Czech intelligence services that one of the 9/11 hijackers, Mohammed Atta, had met with an Iraqi intelligence officer, Ahmad Samir Alani, at the Iraqi embassy in Prague. There was Saddam's past support of terrorism and possession of chemical weapons, and attempts at acquiring nuclear weapons. And there was the connection of Al-Qaeda leader Abu Musab al-Zarqawi receiving medical treatment in Iraq in 2002 after fleeing Afghanistan, who later joined Ansar al-Islam, a Kurdish jihadist group. However, the Czech intelligence report turned out to be false, and although Saddam did provide aid to terrorists, it was not to Al-Qaeda but rather to Palestinian groups. And although Zarqawi was receiving medical treatment in Iraq, there was no evidence that he received any material aid or logistical support from Saddam's regime. On top of this, the Kurdish jihadist group he had joined saw Saddam as an apostate. Before the 2011 raid on bin Laden's Abbottabad compound, Deputy Chief of the CIA told President Obama that there was more evidence that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction than there was evidence for bin Laden being at the compound in Pakistan. After receiving authorization from Congress, the Bush administration invaded Iraq, and 3 weeks later Saddam's regime fell, and by the end of 2003 Saddam Hussein was captured in Operation Red Dawn. However, this would not end the conflict in Iraq. Part of the Bush administration's policy for a post-Saddam Iraq was to remove all former Ba'ath Party members from the bureaucracy, police, and military. This left many Iraqis, mostly Sunnis, isolated from public affairs and at the mercy of the newly empowered Shia. This began the period that much of the media referred to as a civil war. Sunni militias fought against each other along with Iranian-backed Shia militias and the US military. It was during this time that al-Zarqawi founded the Iraqi branch of Al-Qaeda, known as AQI. Many disaffected Sunni joined AQI, not accepting the legitimacy of the new Shia-dominated regime. They attracted many international terrorists as well, in order to protect their own regime by keeping the US bogged down in Iraq. The Assads in Syria released a steady stream of Sunni jihadists from its own prisons into Iraq, many of which would join AQI. Zarqawi and AQI would utilize the internet to recruit members and to spread its own propaganda in the form of violent videos, edited to cinema quality with music and effects. Despite common goals, there were divisions between Al-Qaeda Central, AQC, run by bin Laden, and AQI. AQI practiced takfirism, which is the act of declaring other Muslims apostates and therefore worthy of killing. Bin Laden was against takfirism, especially when applied to civilian populations. Zarqawi's actions were largely independent of bin Laden and AQC. Despite being told not to be harsh with fellow Muslims, Zarqawi found ideological justifications for his actions in a tract called The Management of Savagery. This book instructed jihadists to lure the United States into as many combat zones in the Middle East as possible, to bog them down and to destroy the image of invincibility capability the US military had. In 2006, Zarqawi was killed in an airstrike. Bin Laden's second-in-command, al-Zawahiri, encouraged the remnants of AQI to establish an Islamic State. A few months later, AQI joined with several other Sunni jihadist groups to form the Islamic State of Iraq, or ISI. Zarqawi's successor was an Egyptian fighter known as Abu Omar al-Baghdadi. For a while, ISI distanced itself from sectarian conflict and fell more under Zawahiri's influence, and taking his prophetic advice, establish an Islamic authority or emirate, then develop it and support it until it achieves the level of caliphate, over as much territory as you can. In 2007, the United States implemented a strategy known as the Surge. Developed by General David Petraeus, the Surge consisted of a large influx of troops and a renewed offensive against the sectarian and jihadi militias, including ISI. The strategy seemed to work for a time. Violence went down dramatically and ISI was nearly destroyed. A similar strategy was then implemented on a smaller scale in Afghanistan after Barack Obama came to the White House in 2009. However, things would begin to unravel in December 2010. A police officer in Tunisia confiscated a vegetable cart from a street merchant, Mohammed Bouazizi. In protest of this event, the street merchant set himself on fire, thereby setting off the Arab Spring. Tunisia would avoid most of the violence of the Arab Spring, with President Zine El Abidine Ben Ali stepping down on January 14, 2011. This event inspired protests across North Africa and the Middle East. January 25th saw the beginnings of protests at Tahrir Square in Cairo. After 2 weeks of violence and international pressure from world leaders like Barack Obama, Hosni Mubarak stepped down. Things would not get better for Egypt when in 2012 elections brought the Muslim Brotherhood candidate Mohamed Morsi into the presidency. A year later, he would be ousted in a military-backed coup, who then transferred power to Egypt's constitutional court. On February 15, 2011, protests would break out in Libya against the regime of Muammar Gaddafi. After NATO intervention, the rebel forces would succeed in defeating the Gaddafi regime and killing the dictator. However, Libya continues to be a hotbed of violence with multiple factions along the coast and in the interior. Along with continuing factional violence, there was also an attack on the American consulate in Benghazi, resulting in the death of an ambassador and 3 other Americans. Initially blamed on an anti-Muhammad video on YouTube, it was eventually confirmed to have been a terrorist attack. Just as in Tunisia, the Syrian conflict began with a man immolating himself in protest of the regime. Throughout the early months of 2011, protests spread across Syria, and with each protest, the reaction from the Assad regime became more violent. Eventually, anti-Assad groups were organized and armed themselves and began to fight against the regime. Many of these groups become part of the Free Syrian Army, or FSA. However, the FSA would not be the only ones fighting against Assad. With Syria in chaos and the US beginning to withdraw from Iraq, the new ISI leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, sent veteran guerrilla fighters into Syria to set up a new branch of Al-Qaeda and fight against the Alawite Assad regime. This group would become the Al-Nusra Front, led by Abu Muhammad al-Julani. In 2013, al-Baghdadi announced the merger of ISI and al-Nusra into the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. However, both al-Julani and Zawahiri rejected and denounced this claim. Al-Baghdadi ignored both of them and continued on with the rebranding. Al-Qaeda would eventually disavow ISIS and eliminate its status as an Al-Qaeda affiliate. In June of 2014, ISIS rebranded again, proclaiming itself the Islamic State, a worldwide caliphate, with its leader al-Baghdadi taking on a new name and title, Caliph Ibrahim, claiming successorship to the Prophet Muhammad. The kingdoms of Jordan and Saudi Arabia moved troops to their borders with Iraq, much of which had been abandoned by the Iraqi government and taken over by the Islamic State. The summer of 2014 saw much of northern and western Iraq fall to Islamic State forces. In many cases, the Iraqi army dropped their weapons, removed their uniforms, and fled without a fight. They began to heavily persecute and commit genocide of Christians, Yazidis, Shia, and any Sunni who did not subscribe to the Islamic State's brand of radical Islam. A group of radical Islamists captured territory in Libya and proclaimed allegiance to the Islamic State and al-Baghdadi. Factions from Ansar Balt al-Mahdi in Egypt, along with Boko Haram in Nigeria, would also pledge allegiance. They have become known for their levels of violence that even groups like Al-Qaeda have condemned. What ideology would allow a group to commit such atrocities? The members of ISIS believe they are fighting in an apocalyptic struggle. One of the most important places captured by ISIS is a small town in northern Syria called Dabiq. In Islamic eschatology, Dabiq is where the final battle between Muslims and Christians will be fought. The last hour would not come until the Romans would land at Al-Amaq or in Dabiq. An army consisting of the best soldiers of the people of the earth at that time will come from Medina. This is the Islamic equivalent of the Battle of Armageddon. And after their divinely ordained victory, they believe only 4 legitimate caliphs will succeed al-Baghdadi before Judgment Day. Islam shall neither pass away nor will be deviated while there are my 12 caliphs from my nation in it. All of them will be from Quraysh. When the last of them passes away, the hour will be established and the earth will be destroyed with all its inhabitants. At the end of days, Muslims believe that a figure called the Mahdi will come to the world and kill all the enemies of the Prophet and rule over it. This is the motivation of ISIS. They are fighting as though it were the end of the world, and to those who are living under them, it must certainly feel that way. Iran is one of the oldest continuing civilizations on Earth. It has clashed with the West for thousands of years, from the Greco-Persian wars that defined the West to the modern Islamist regime of the Ayatollahs. The conflict predates both Islam and Christianity. In ancient times, the Persians expanded their territorial control outside of modern-day Iran. At its height, it controlled all or parts of modern-day Romania, Bulgaria, Greece, Turkey, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Israel, the West Bank, Gaza, Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Oman, Iraq, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. Muslims out of the Arabian Peninsula conquered Persia and converted most of the local Zoroastrian population to Islam. However, it wouldn't be until the 16th century when Shah Ismail I would conquer Persia, Azerbaijan, and Iraq, and force Sunni Muslims to convert to 12 or Shia Islam in order to differentiate themselves from the Sunni Ottoman Turks. The modern nation of Iran would be founded in 1925 when Reza Shah founded the Pahlavi dynasty. Having friendly relations with Nazi Germany, in 1935 Reza Shah officially changed the name of his country from Persia to Iran, which means land of the Aryans. To ensure access to Iranian oil for the Allies, Reza Shah was overthrown by a joint Anglo-Soviet invasion during World War II. His son, Mohammad Reza Shah, would succeed him and would remain ruler in Iran until 1979. During World War II, the Soviets aided the Communist Tudeh Party of Iran. Iranian communists set up paramilitary groups that had security in the Soviet-occupied north. When Mohammad Mossadegh became Prime Minister of Iran, he campaigned to nationalize the oil industry. The support he received from the Tudeh Party led the CIA and British intelligence services to believe that Mossadegh was friendly with the Soviets. To prevent the expansion of the Soviet Union into the Middle East, they orchestrated a coup of the Mossadegh government, restoring authoritarian power to Mohammad Reza Shah. This type of action has created a deep mistrust between the Americans and the Iranians that has not since recovered. During his reign, Mohammad Reza Shah sought to modernize Iran, both culturally and economically. However, the traditional religious authorities did not approve of these changes. This eventually led to the Islamic Revolution of 1979, with Ayatollah Khomeini taking power as supreme leader. The newly established Islamic Republic of Iran would be attacked by its neighbor, Ba'athist Iraq. During the 1980s, Iran would become the poster child for state-sponsored terrorism. With the Iranian Revolutionary Guard protecting the revolution at home, it would go abroad to spread the revolution outside their own borders. The first major creation of the Revolutionary Guard would be Hezbollah in Lebanon, who would manage to fight off both the Israelis and the Americans. Iran would continue to expand its influence in foreign territory by allying itself with the Alawite regime in Syria. After the US invasion of Afghanistan following the 9/11 attacks, Iran granted safety and asylum to several al-Qaeda leaders fleeing US forces. When the US invaded Iraq in 2003, Iranian agents were on the ground, rallying and organizing the local Shia majority population. Some of these groups would form militias that would eventually fight against American and coalition forces. The new Iraqi government would be controlled by Shia Muslims who were friendly to Iran. Many in the Iraqi government, according to Robert Baer in The Devil We Know, are often deferential to Iranian interests. When Hamas won the open elections in the Gaza Strip after Israel withdrew in 2005, Iran began to send arms to the terrorist group, who would then go on to launch rocket attacks on Israeli civilians, resulting in Israeli retaliation. Much of the Persian Gulf is populated with Shia Muslims. This has made the Persian Gulf monarchies very weary of the Iranians, fearing they could launch a swift attack that they could not repel, or blocking off the Persian Gulf, which would cause a spike in the price of oil. For the first time in decades, the Sunni monarchs are visiting Iran in an attempt to stay on good terms. regimes, and former Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was the first Iranian leader since the revolution to be invited to Saudi Arabia to participate in the Hajj. They have also made inroads in their relations with the Kurds in Iraq and Syria. The Kurdish people are ethnic Iranians, however they practice Sunni Islam rather than Shia. Recent attacks on the Turkish Kurds by the Turkish military has also pushed the PKK into the arms of the Iranians. The Iranians are also known for their complicated relationship with nuclear weapons. Even before the revolution, Mohammad Reza Shah had been seeking nuclear capabilities. Just as today they claim it was only for energy, and just like in the 1970s, the US government didn't believe the Iranian government. Before the revolution, the US campaigned its allies not to sell nuclear supplies to Iran in order to prevent the proliferation of atomic weapons. After the revolution, the Ayatollah halted the Iranian nuclear program, fearing it as a form of Western corruption. However, in the 90s, a nuclear program would be relaunched, around the same time the US was inspecting Iraq for WMDs. This conflict over Iranian nuclear weapons continues to this day. What is motivating the Iranian regime? The former president of Iran, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, was known for his anti-Semitic statements, but one aspect of his beliefs was often glossed over by most of the media.
In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful, all praise belongs to Allah, the Lord of the worlds, and may peace and blessings be upon the greatest and trustworthy Prophet and his pure progeny, his chosen companions, and upon all divine messengers. O God, hasten the emergence of your chosen beloved. Grant him good health and victory. Make us his best companions and all those who attest to his rightfulness.
These beliefs fall within the idea of Mahdism, the Islamic version of the Messiah. To understand the importance of this, one must know the roots of Shia Islam. The first schism within Islam occurred after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. The community of Muslims was uncertain of who should succeed the Prophet as leader of the faithful. This came down to those who supported Muhammad's advisor and father-in-law, Abu Bakr, and those who supported Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law, Ali. Those that supported Abu Bakr became known as the Sunni, which means the people of tradition and consensus. Those that supported Ali became known as the Shia, which means followers, faction, or party of Ali. Ali, not wanting to cause a split in the community, allowed Abu Bakr to become the first successor of Muhammad. Two more caliphs would be selected before Ali would be chosen. Ali would be referred to as the last of the rightly guided caliphs. Sunni Muslims recognize the legitimacy of all four rightly guided caliphs, but Shia Muslims believe that only Ali was legitimate. The Sunni believe that the community of Muslims with religious guidance could select the leader of the Ummah. The Shia believe that only Allah could choose the successor to Muhammad, and so they believe that Muhammad's bloodline through his daughter Fatima and Ali held sole right to succeed the Prophet. Under Ali's reign, the Islamic Empire began to fragment, and in 661 AD he was assassinated. Ali and those who succeeded him hold the title of Imam within Shia Islam. These titles passed from fathers to sons to brothers until it reached the 12th Imam, Muhammad al-Mahdi, who disappeared in 874 AD at the age of 4. The Shia believe that he will return at the end of days to restore order and justice. This is the basis for the largest sect of Shia Islam, the Twelvers. The Shia have always been a minority in the Middle East, with only 10% of Muslims worldwide calling themselves Shia, in contrast to the 87% who call themselves Sunni. Because of this, the Shia Muslims have more often than not been oppressed by their Sunni rulers. This history of submission is also fueled by a traditionally held belief that all will be made right by the 12th Imam. Now, where does Ahmadinejad play into this? Ahmadinejad is a Mahdist who believes that the Mahdi will return to the world sooner, if the conditions of the end times can be created in the world now. Time will pass rapidly, good deeds will decrease, miserliness will be thrown into the hearts of the people, and the Hajj will increase. They asked, "What is the Hajj?" He replied, "It is killing, it is murdering." The hour will come when violence, bloodshed, and anarchy become common. This belief sheds light on the actions of the Iranian regime supporting terrorism. But what about the Iranian leadership today? Ahmadinejad is out of power. Does anyone else share these Mahdist beliefs? Since the Safavids, the Iranian government has sought to restrain Mahdism. Even the Iranian Revolution continued this practice, despite officially naming the 12th Imam as the true leader of Iran. Both Ayatollahs Khomeini and Khamenei have made it policy to repress Mahdism. However, the Supreme Leader and the Guardian Council allowing an extremely open Mahdist such as Ahmadinejad to run for president at all is a sure sign that the regime either needs more support to maintain itself, or they have changed their own beliefs on Mahdism. It may also have to do with a new generation coming into power in Iran, a generation that either believes in Mahdism or is willing to use it for political gain. The rise of ISIS has forced Iran to intervene in Iraq on behalf of the Shia government there. Defeating ISIS in Iraq will also weaken ISIS in Syria. who is under assault from radical Islamists and the Free Syrian Army. What is Iran's endgame? With their history and current practice of extending their territorial influence, their pursuance of nuclear capabilities, and their end times beliefs, what is coming? Iran is seeking to establish a new empire in the Middle East. They have control of Iraq, Lebanon, and the areas of Syria still held by Assad. These are many of the territories that the old Persian empires have controlled off and on throughout history, from before Islam. Their desire for nuclear weapons shows their determination to keep this new empire, and the embracing of modernism may give their people the religious zeal needed to fight an apocalyptic struggle with ISIS, Israel, and the West. The Federal Reserve was created to regulate and control the monetary policy and money supply of the United States. In the over 100 years of its existence, the results of its policies have been mixed. Before the Federal Reserve, monetary policy was handled at the level of states and individual banks. Banks would charter through the state they were located in, and would have to meet the requirements of that individual state. This led to multiple currencies floating around the United States from different banks. Many of these banks were unstable, especially those in western states and territories, where a need for easy loans and cash flow was most needed. During the Civil War, the National Bank Act created a system where banks could be chartered through the federal government rather than state governments. The federal government began taxing the scrip coming out of state banks, which encouraged many to recharter themselves as national banks. This helped create monetary uniformity across the United States, making the flow of money quicker and easier. However, it also tied more banks together, meaning that a banking crisis would also impact more people and regions. In 1907, a bank run was triggered by a failed attempt by Otto and Augustus Heinz to corner the United Copper Company. Due to insufficient funds, the Heinz brothers were unable to accomplish their scheme. The United Copper Company, owned by Augustus Heinz, collapsed. This forced the State Savings Bank of Butte, Montana, also owned by Augustus Heinz, to declare insolvency. This bank had been using United Copper stock as collateral for its loans, which became worthless after the collapse of United Copper. This bank was a correspondent bank of the Mercantile National Bank, whose president was Augustus Heinz. Due to this association, thousands of patrons who deposited their money there ran on the bank to withdraw their money before the bank collapsed. This then triggered runs on other associated banks and trust companies, leading to a full-blown banking crisis. JP Morgan orchestrated a bailout with other big bankers and trust companies to stop the crisis. To avoid having to foot the bill himself again, JP Morgan met with other bankers, along with Senator Nelson Aldrich, who drafted legislation for the creation of a national bank. In 1913, the Federal Reserve Act would be signed by President Woodrow Wilson, just in time for the world to plunge into war. During the 1920s, the Federal Reserve had an easy money policy. This allowed for large amounts of borrowing with low interest. Much of this borrowed money was used to invest in the stock market. This caused stock prices to rise. Inflation of goods was not felt because industrial output also soared, keeping pace with the increase in money supply. In 1927, a new Fed chairman, Roy Young, led the Federal Reserve in restricting monetary expansion after a decade. However, when the stock market crash came in 1929, this policy would lead to hundreds of banks shutting down after the bank runs. Fear of another economic downturn like the Great Depression has led to policymakers in both the government and the Federal Reserve to crafting policies to avoid that very fate. The 2000s saw record low interest rates for home loans. With certainty of bailouts from the federal government and the Federal Reserve, banks and other financial institutions felt safe making ever greater number of loans to those who had been previously labeled as credit risks. These malinvestments created a bubble which eventually popped, triggering the financial crisis. Both the federal government and the Federal Reserve acted to stop a financial crash by bailing out banks and corporations. By June of 2010, the Federal Reserve had created $2.1 trillion with QE1. However, the economy was still growing slowly. In order to encourage exports, Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke approved another round of money printing called QE2. The plan was to encourage greater foreign investment into the US by devaluing the currency, which is easily done by money printing. In Currency Wars, James Rickards describes the events of a round of monetary devaluation between the US and China. The US managed to devalue its currency faster than China, resulting in US goods being more competitively priced on the international market. However, this results in everything priced in US dollars to become more expensive, including food. In the months leading up to the ousting of Zine El Abidine Ben Ali in Tunisia, food prices began to rise worldwide, especially in the Middle East, where food prices are always higher than the world average. The protests that eventually became the Arab Spring began as protests against rising food prices. The Tunisian government shut down the internet in order to disorganize the protesters. However, this move backfired, and protests grew even larger, eventually spreading across the rest of the Arab world. Rising food prices, whether caused by shortage of food or expansionist monetary policy, is always a motivating factor in revolution. Policies of the ancient regime in France that restricted the importation of food, along with a confiscatory tax system that disproportionately impacted peasants, was a driving force of the early stages of the French Revolution. World War I diverted large sums of food from the marketplace to the front lines in the Russian Empire. Along with this, the Russian central bank unpegged the ruble from gold and proceeded to print large amounts of paper money, leading to hyperinflation, which exacerbated the problem. Expansionary monetary policy always leads to inflation, and when the price of necessities such as food goes beyond the average person's affordability, violent revolution is all the more likely. The previous regimes in the Arab world were horrible dictatorships, but have the lives of the Arab people improved since the overthrowing and destabilizing? The policies of central bankers have a greater and faster impact on the world than those of the politicians that put them there. There is something that needs to be made abundantly clear. The Arab Spring, the rise of ISIS, and the new Iranian Empire are not the goals of the Federal Reserve. There isn't a vast conspiracy of international bankers in any form or incarnation trying to destabilize the Middle East or the rest of the world for their own gain. There is a far more important lesson to be learned here. All actions have consequences, intended and unintended. The intent of an action taken by a government or a central bank can be purely humanitarian, but still result in catastrophic consequences. What we must learn as policymakers and citizens is to learn from past mistakes and understand the possible consequences of current actions. This has been Connect the Dots, Episode 3, ISIS, Iran, and the Federal Reserve. Thanks for watching.